I'll order for her, my son told the waiter. Without looking at me, his wife smirked like I was furniture. The menu stayed shut, my mouth did too. When the appetizers arrived, I slid an envelope onto his plate. He opened it, still chewing, and choked when he read the words legal notice. You're no longer in control. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The lobster boats drifted silently beyond the glass, their white hulls glowing gold in the last sweep of sunlight over Portland Harbor. Inside the restaurant, candlelight danced in crystal water glasses, and the scent of melted butter, white wine, and grilled haddock laced the air. Helen Draper, poised in a navy coat and silk scarf, sat straight-backed at the table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The waiter smiled and turned to her. "And for you, ma'am?" "She's fine," Mark cut in. His tone was brisk, practiced, like someone used to deciding for others. "Just bring her water." Helen blinked once. She didn't look at her son. Instead, she watched the waiter, a young man no older than 22, freeze mid-scribble, his pen hovering above the order pad like a nervous sparrow. The pause dragged an extra second too long. "She doesn't usually eat this late," Mark added, flashing a dismissive grin. "It messes with her whatever." Lila stirred beside him but didn't lift her eyes from the breadbasket. She tore a roll in half with quiet precision, buttered it slowly, as if it might keep her invisible. The waiter shifted his weight. Would you like anything at all, ma'am?" Helen reached for the water glass already before her, took a deliberate sip and smiled. A slow, contained movement that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Water will do for now," she said softly. "Thank you." The waiter gave her a polite nod, but as he turned to walk away he gave Mark a quick glance, not deferential, not admiring, just puzzled, maybe even a little embarrassed. Mark leaned back in his chair, already launching into a story about a new client, someone massively connected, someone whose name he dropped like a casual flex. Helen listened in practiced stillness, nodding where necessary. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. But she noted everything. The way Mark never once looked at her while talking. The way Lila kept her gaze locked on the flickering candle. The way the waiter placed dishes down in front of everyone, except her. Helen's plate remained empty. Not a mistake. Not an oversight. A choice. The faint clink of silverware filled the silence where she should have been eating. Across the table, Mark launched into a second story. Something about someone being too sensitive in a deposition. He laughed at his own punchline, then frowned when Helen didn't join in. "You all right, Mom?" She dabbed at the corner of her mouth, even though it was spotless. "Perfectly. See?" he said to Lila. "Told you she's tough as nails." Lila gave a thin smile and took a slow sip of wine. Dinner continued with the soft murmur of the harbor behind them. Mark ate heartily, waving his fork as he talked. Lila kept glancing at her watch. Helen said little. She just let the discomfort ferment, a vintage she'd grown accustomed to, but never enjoyed. When dessert menus arrived, Mark declined for everyone. "We're good here." The check came fast. They stood outside 15 minutes later beneath the restaurant's hanging lanterns. Fog was rolling in now, making the cobblestone sidewalk glisten. Mark patted Helen's shoulder. "Next time we'll go somewhere more your style. You know, quieter." "Good night, Mark," Helen said. He didn't notice the steel in her voice. Or maybe he did, and he thought she wouldn't use it. She waited until she was back in her own house, the quiet of the West End pressing in like a familiar coat, before she called Ruth. Her friend answered on the first ring. "You're home early." Helen set her purse on the foyer table. "He told the waiter I wouldn't be ordering." Ruth's voice dropped. "He what, told him to skip me?" No consultation, no eye contact. Jesus, Helen. Helen moved into the kitchen, flicked on the kettle. It wasn't about the meal, it was the statement. "Oh, I know what it was about," Ruth snapped. "He wanted to shrink you in front of people. Make you disappear." The kettle hissed behind her. Helen didn't respond. She didn't have to. Ruth's voice softened. "That's grounds for more than a complaint." Helen smiled faintly, her fingers resting on the marble counter. The teacup beside her gleamed under the warm light, delicate porcelain and still perfectly whole. The scent of old paper and lemon oil filled the law office, mingling with the distant wail of a foghorn from Casco Bay. Helen sat across from Patrick Shea, her legs crossed, her navy wool coat still buttoned. She hadn't taken it off since she arrived. She didn't plan to stay long, just long enough to make the first move. Patrick, trim and methodical in a charcoal gray sweater, tapped a capped pen against his legal pad. "You want to file a complaint against the restaurant." His tone was mild, non-judgmental. Helen's smile was thin, almost amused. "The restaurant? No." The boy taking orders was polite. He glanced at me twice, looking for permission. "My son was the one who dismissed me like an expired coupon." Patrick gave a low grunt of acknowledgement. "Still, that kind of public disrespect. I didn't come here to correct his manners, Patrick. I came here to make a point." She reached into her handbag, withdrew a napkin, linen, neatly folded, and placed it on his desk. Written in blue ink across the hem was a single note, in her precise cursive. "He made me invisible on purpose. So let's make him accountable on paper." Patrick read it, then let out a slow breath. "Helen, what exactly are you thinking?" Before she could answer, a familiar voice chimed in from the doorway. "Tell him about the lease." Ruth Connolly strode into the room without knocking, the heels of her boots echoing on the hardwood. She held 2 takeaway coffees, handing one to Helen. "Mark's living in your West End rental, isn't he?" Helen took the cup. "For the last 5 years. Reduced rent, no deposit, no respect." Patrick sat up straighter, eyes sharpening like a man finally seeing the full board of a chess match. "Does he have a lease?" Helen nodded. "Signed in 2020. I have a copy in my home files." "Good," Patrick said, flipping his legal pad to a fresh page. "Because if you're serious, that gives us leverage." Ruth chuckled as she dropped into a nearby leather chair. He ordered her water like she was a potted plant. "You don't bounce back from that, Pat." Patrick didn't smile. His mind was already working, swift and clinical. Any known violations, late payments, unauthorized guests? Helen sipped her coffee. "I don't want revenge for dinner, I want correction for years." Ruth leaned forward. "Tell him about the subletting." "Twice," Helen said, setting her cup down gently. "Once when he went to Miami for 2 months and let his friend Crashens there. Another time, last Thanksgiving, he rented the unit out short-term while they visited Lila's sister in Vermont." Patrick was already jotting notes. "Both breach of lease terms." "I have photos," Ruth added, pulling out her phone. "From when I checked on the house for Helen. Different cars in the driveway, trash bags piled high. A second dog." Helen didn't say anything. She just watched Patrick work. The way his eyes flicked over bullet points, how his knuckles whitened slightly when he wrote grounds for termination. "You're sitting on enforceable power," he said finally, looking up. "If we proceed carefully, you can terminate his lease and remove him. It's not quick, but it's solid." And he added, "If he tries to fight it, he'll be doing so while standing on a pile of violations." Helen leaned back slowly, finally unbuttoning her coat, her spine straight, her chin high. "Let's start with a meeting. I'll pull the lease. You'll verify the terms." Patrick nodded. "I'll draft preliminary notice language in case we decide to act." Ruth grinned over the rim of her coffee cup. "Now that's dessert." Helen tilted her head, amused. "No, Ruth. That's the appetizer." The room went quiet for a moment, save for the ticking of the office clock and the distant hum of a bus passing Monument Square. Patrick slid his pad to the edge of the desk, steepling his fingers. "Ready to serve something he won't forget?" The file cabinet creaked open like a vault unlocking, each folder humming with memories Helen had long catalogued but never forgotten. She pulled out the thick envelope marked Draper, West End property, and laid it on her antique writing desk, the edges sharp and unbent. The lease rested inside, signed with Mark's confident looping signature, the kind that looked like it expected to be forgiven before finishing the first letter. She ran her fingers over the date, March 15, 2020. He never read it. Not really. Just skimmed it, cracked a joke about boilerplate clauses, and signed where she pointed. She remembered him balancing a mug of craft beer on one knee while skimming the page, barely pretending to care. "You trust me, right, Mom?" he'd said. Trust, she thought now, was not a substitute for compliance. She placed the lease under a reading lamp and read every line aloud. The subletting clause, clearly prohibited without written consent. She highlighted it. The pet clause, limited to one dog, no exceptions. She circled it. And the payment schedule, monthly, due by the 5th. She retrieved a separate folder containing every deposit receipt. 6 late payments, 3 over 2 weeks behind. Downstairs the old radiators groaned with heat. Outside, bare branches scratched against the windows in a whispery rhythm. Helen heard Ruth's boots on the porch before the knock came. Ruth swept in without waiting. "I brought the receipts," she said, holding up a plastic sleeve with printed photos. "From the Thanksgiving debacle, that wasn't family visiting. I caught plates with different names on the mailbox, and a second golden retriever." Helen gave her a tight smile. "He thought the holidays would distract me." Men like Mark always think women his mother's age stop paying attention. Ruth placed the photos beside the lease. "He's about to learn otherwise." Helen nodded, then dialed Patrick. "I have what you need," she told him. "Multiple documented violations. Lease in full. Photos." "Good," he replied. "Let's meet Tuesday. I'll prepare options." She hung up, placed the lease and evidence in a flat leather folio, and tucked it into her bag. Her breath felt easier now, like space had opened in her chest. The beginning of something solid, not revenge, exactly, but remedy. As she zipped her bag shut, her phone buzzed with a message. Mark, 1:42 p.m. "Hey, thinking we should grab lunch soon. Just us. Haven't done that in a while. Let me know what works for you." Ruth saw the screen and snorted. "You're kidding." Helen read the text again. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what he'd done, just a bland suggestion dropped like a breadcrumb, as if he were doing her a favor by offering a sliver of his time. She didn't reply. Instead, she picked up her bag and stood, shoulders square. "He's reaching for charm now," Ruth muttered, holding the door open. "That's always their last currency, when they think trouble's coming." Helen stepped outside into the crisp Portland air. The harbor wind tugged at her scarf and made her eyes sting. But it wasn't the cold that tightened her jaw. It was the sudden, delicious thought that Mark had no idea the walls were already moving in. Patrick sat alone at his desk 2 hours later, reading the scanned documents Helen had emailed. His eyes paused on the subletting clause, then moved to the receipts and time-stamped images. He tapped his pen 3 times against the table. Then he clicked open a blank document and began to type. Notice to vacate. Breach of lease terms. The scent of roast chicken curled through the air like a ribbon. Rosemary, garlic, lemon and heat mingling in the old Victorian's wide-beamed dining room. Helen moved with quiet precision, placing polished silverware beside porcelain plates trimmed in gold. The candles flickered in their brass holders. Everything gleamed. Everything was intentional. This dinner was a performance, and she had rehearsed it to perfection. In the corner, Ruth adjusted the edge of the linen table runner, then stepped back, inspecting the spread. "You could be hosting a senator, Helen." "No," Helen said, smoothing a napkin with one hand, while the other carefully slid a thick white envelope beside the plate at the head of the table. "Just my son." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "You sure about the wine glasses?" "I'd have gone with brandy, more dramatic when someone drops it." Helen didn't smile. "He won't drop anything. He'll grip that paper like it's burning." The doorbell rang before Ruth could respond. Lila entered first, holding a bottle of red wine wrapped in a brown paper bag, still warm from the car. "Thought this might pair well with your roast." Helen took it politely. "That's thoughtful." Mark followed, loud and grinning, already loosening his scarf. "This smells incredible, Mom. You've still got it." He leaned in to kiss her cheek. A casual, hollow gesture. "It's been a while since we did this. Should have happened sooner." "Indeed," Helen said, stepping aside. They settled at the table, the harbor light fading through lace curtains. Ruth stayed to one side, sipping sparkling water with a quiet smirk. She didn't speak much. She didn't need to. Helen carved the chicken with elegant ease, plating it herself, Mark, Leela, Ruth, then her own. Steamed asparagus, roasted sweet potatoes, warm sourdough, the room filled with the soft clinks of silverware, the hum of polite conversation. It was all so warm, so civilized. Until Helen reached down and lifted the envelope. She placed it beside Mark's plate with a calm, deliberate motion. "This came for you." Mark blinked. "Here?" Helen nodded. "I thought you might want to read it before dessert." Leela stiffened, hand pausing mid-reach for her wine glass. Mark gave a short laugh, picking it up. "You're still mailing me stuff? We text, you know." He slid a finger under the seal and pulled out the papers. His eyes scanned the first line, then the second. His jaw slackened. He read it again, slower this time, like the words had betrayed him. Across from him, Helen delicately spooned cranberry compote onto her plate. What is this?" Mark finally said. Ruth leaned in, her fork hovering above her chicken. "Looks like a notice to make. Effective 30 days from receipt." Mark turned to Helen, stunned. "You're evicting me?" Helen didn't look up. "No, your lease violations did that. I'm just notifying you." "You're serious?" His voice cracked with something between shock and rising heat. "You're kicking your own son out of his house. Over what? A couple late rent checks." Helen met his eyes, calm, steady. "Over 5 late rent checks. And 2 illegal sublets. And a second dog. And most recently, the erasure of my presence in public, like I was an inconvenience." Leela shifted uncomfortably. "Helen, maybe we should talk about this." "We are talking about it," Helen said, lifting her wine glass. "Over dinner, just like family." Mark stood abruptly, chair legs screeching against hardwood. "This is insane. You're actually doing this." "I already have," she said. The silence was deep and immediate. The only sound was the faint tick of the wall clock, and the wind pressing faintly against the stained glass windows. Mark stared at the document in his hands. The formal font, the legal phrasing, the firm signature of Patrick Shea at the bottom. His color drained like someone had pulled a plug. He sank slowly back into the chair, but didn't pick up his fork. Across the table, Helen buttered her roll, her expression unreadable. Mark's chair screeched again as he shoved it back from the table, his fingers tightening around the eviction notice, like it might vanish if he crushed it hard enough. His face was a dark mottled red, the kind that came right before something reckless. "You're actually doing this to your own son." His voice was raised now, sharp and brittle. "Over a couple dogs and some rent checks." Helen didn't flinch. She calmly reached for her water glass, the stem clicking softly against the plate. "I'm doing this because I've been invisible in your life unless you need something. This notice is just the first time I've said it out loud." The fire crackled faintly from the corner of the room. Outside, wind slapped tree branches against the windows. Inside, tension wrapped the table like a wire. "This is betrayal," Mark snapped, jabbing the folded paper toward her like an accusation. "You waited until we were sitting at your dinner table. You planned this whole evening." "I did," Helen said, calmly buttering a sweet potato. "You planned the public humiliation. I simply responded with appropriate formality." Lila's voice came low, nearly a whisper. "Helen, is it real?" Helen turned to her with a softened gaze. "It's signed, notarized, and filed with a timestamp." "Yes, Lila. It's very real." Mark let out a laugh, but it was hollow and ugly. "You think this is power? Evicting your son like I'm a squatter?" "Technically," Ruth said, lifting her wine glass and peering at it in the candlelight. "You're a leaseholder in violation of multiple terms. She's not throwing you out. You broke the agreement." Mark shot her a glare. "You're enjoying this." "I am," Ruth said, sipping. "Immensely." Mark slammed his palm on the table. Not hard enough to knock anything over, but enough to jolt the water in his glass and rattle a spoon. The candles trembled slightly. Helen didn't blink. "That's enough. I gave you years of respect," he barked. "I let you keep that house. I've included you in things. Don't pretend I didn't try." Helen finally looked him dead in the eye. "You gave me crumbs when it benefited your image. You interrupted me in public and decided I didn't deserve to be heard. You didn't try. You tolerated me. Lila stared at her plate, cheeks flushed. Mark opened his mouth, then closed it. Rage circled just beneath his skin, hot and helpless. Helen's phone buzzed softly on the sideboard. She didn't check it immediately. She let the moment hang, uncomfortable and necessary. Mark threw his napkin on the table, scoffing. Well, you've made your point. Congratulations. He stood yanking his coat off the back of the chair. You want to play court games. Fine, but don't expect a call when things go sideways. You're on your own. He stalked toward the front hallway, steps echoing through the hardwood. Mark, Helen called after him. He paused at the coat rack, not turning around. Next time you show up to someone's table, she said evenly, make sure you came to dine, not dominate. He yanked open the front door and disappeared into the cold. Silence returned like a blanket, the clatter of his departure slowly replaced by the gentle crackle of firewood and the faint ticking of the dining room clock. Lila stood slowly, still not making eye contact. Thank you for dinner. You're welcome, Helen said. The front door shut a second time. Ruth exhaled. I was hoping he'd knock something over, just a little drama for the full effect. Helen finally picked up her phone. One new text from Patrick. Filed. Court timestamp confirms 4:27 p.m. You're officially in motion. She set the phone down and picked up her fork again. Eat, Ruth said. It's getting cold. Helen cut into her chicken. He thought anger would scare me. Ruth raised her glass again. He forgot who taught him how to hold a fork. Helen smiled, until the phone rang this time, slicing the quiet with a shrill chime. She reached for it, expecting Patrick again. But it wasn't. Gwen Miller. The harbor side. She blinked. Ruth leaned over. The restaurant owner? Helen answered. Helen speaking. Gwen's voice came warm, but edged with something firm. I saw everything, Helen. Your son's tantrum, your silence, all of it. If you ever want a real meal, it's on the house. Anytime. The host recognized her the moment she stepped through the glass doors. Helen Draper. He said with a warm, almost reverent tone. Miss Miller told us to treat you like royalty. She didn't smile, but she nodded with a polite ease. That's very kind. The sea breeze had followed her in, faint and briny, carrying whispers of low tide and late summer fog. The restaurant glowed like a lantern against the harbor dusk, warm light bouncing off wine glasses, soft jazz drifting from hidden speakers, and a faint peppery tang in the air from something grilling in the kitchen. As she was guided to a private corner table near the tall windows, Helen let herself breathe in the quiet luxury of solitude. She took her seat in the same dining room, where her son had spoken over her, silenced her, and smirked like a man without consequence. Tonight she sat alone, and she chose everything. I'll have the mussels to start, she said, reading the menu with interest, then the halibut, and a glass of the chablis. Excellent choices, the server replied, refilling her water with practiced grace. Chef's compliments tonight.
Sure.
Your table is on the house. She nodded again, neither flustered nor falsely modest. Thank you. I plan to enjoy it. The first bite of mussels arrived in a deep bowl, steam rising with garlic and white wine, the sauce rich with butter and thyme. Helen dipped the crusty bread and took her time. Outside the window, a lobster boat drifted by, silhouetted in amber. She watched it move across the bay like a slow, silent apology. By the time her halibut arrived, plated elegantly with fennel leeks and a citrus glaze, she'd begun to feel the tension of the last few days unravel from her spine. She sat straighter now, not as armor, but as presence. No one was rushing her. No one was deciding for her. The fork moved at her pace, the conversation replaced by the clinking of flatware and soft murmurs from neighboring tables. When dessert menus came, she waved hers away. I'm expecting someone to join me, she said. And 5 minutes later Ruth appeared, sweeping through the entrance in her charcoal coat and plaid scarf, like she belonged in a noir film. She made a beeline to the table and grinned as she sat. Look at you, goddess of reclamation. I'm full, Helen said, but I saved you a bite of the halibut.
Please.
I'm here for dessert and gossip. Ruth grabbed the wine list with flair. And if they don't have that lavender creme brulee, I'm staging a protest. The waiter reappeared. Ruth ordered the brulee and a whiskey. Helen, amused, settled on chamomile tea. Once their plates and drinks arrived, Ruth raised her glass. To peace and paperwork. Helen tapped her teacup to it. In proper service, they both laughed, not loudly, but freely. The kind of laugh that lingers in the chest afterward. Ruth was midway through her second spoonful of custard when Helen's phone buzzed. She didn't need to check the screen. She knew that vibration, short, urgent, careless. Still she looked. Mark Draper, 8:44 p.m. You've officially lost it. You know that, right? No one treats family this way. You're pathetic, Helen. You'll die alone and bitter, and when you do, no one will come to your damn funeral. Ruth glanced over. Is it him? Helen locked the phone without responding. Still not getting what he wants, so he's pushing buttons. You want to block him? Ruth offered, already reaching for her purse. I've got a portable charger and emotional support pepper spray. I don't need to block him, Helen said, sipping her tea. I just don't need to answer. They let the moment pass, quiet again. Sweetness lingered in the air, vanilla and scorched sugar crust, but then her phone buzzed again. This time it was Patrick. Patrick Shea, 8:49 p.m. Mark just contacted me. Says he wants to negotiate. Thought you should know. Helen stared at the message, her lips curling into something between a smirk and a sigh. Ruth looked up from her dessert. What now? Helen folded her napkin. Looks like he's trying to order from a menu that's already been closed. Mark arrived 10 minutes late to Patrick Shea's office, smelling faintly of menthol gum and aftershave that couldn't quite mask the sour trace of stress. He wore his usual confidence, like armor-tailored coat, gleaming watch, smug grin, but his hands fidgeted more than usual as he sank into the leather chair across from the attorney's desk. Patrick barely looked up from his papers. Coffee? I'm good, Mark replied, tapping the armrest with his index finger. Let's just get to it. You represent my mother, right? I do. Patrick folded his hands atop a manila folder. You asked for this meeting. So state your offer. Mark leaned forward, all charm. Look, we both know this eviction thing is a power play. She's angry, sure, but she doesn't actually want to throw her only son onto the street. Patrick didn't flinch. It's not a play, it's a filing. Legally served, and she's well within her rights. Come on. Mark gave a short, humorless laugh. You know how family stuff gets. Emotions, miscommunications. There were no miscommunications, Patrick said, sliding a document across the table. Here's the lease your client signed. Section 12. No subletting. Section 4. Payment due on the 5th of every month. You've violated both. Repeatedly. Mark's jaw twitched. You think I'm the only tenant in Portland who's been late or let a friend stay over. I think you're the only tenant who did all that while living rent-reduced in his mother's property, Patrick said flatly, and then insulted her in public. That part's not legally relevant, but it's humanly significant. Mark exhaled through his nose, leaning back hard. She's really going through with this. She is. Patrick opened the folder, revealing printed photo evidence, time-stamped emails, and the notice to vacate. Your bargaining position is but if you're proposing a move-out schedule to avoid further escalation, I'll listen. Mark narrowed his eyes. I want to stay through the holidays. We've got plans. Guests coming. I'll pay full rent starting next month. Patrick didn't even lift his pen. You've already forfeited that option. My client isn't interested in compromise. She's interested in closure. Mark stood suddenly, pacing the edge of the office. This is outrageous. You know she's being vindictive, right? She's being precise, Patrick replied. Something you should try sometime. 2 hours later, Helen sat at her kitchen table, the faint scent of lavender polish still clinging to the freshly wiped counters. Her laptop pinged softly with a new email from Patrick Shea. Subject: Summary of today's meeting. Mark attempted to negotiate a continuation of tenancy through the holidays. I declined on your behalf. His legal position is weak and emotional tone erratic. No counteroffer is recommended. Helen didn't hesitate. She clicked reply. Thank you. Please proceed as planned. No concessions. She hit send, then closed the laptop with a satisfying snap. Ruth, sitting nearby with her feet up on the ottoman, popped a pistachio from a ceramic bowl. He tried charm, didn't he? He always does when he thinks charm is cheaper than consequences, Helen murmured. Good, Ruth said, tossing the shell into the waste bowl. Don't budge an inch. I won't. That night, as the sun slipped behind the pine trees edging the neighborhood, Helen's phone buzzed again. She picked it up, expecting Patrick or possibly a passive-aggressive email from Mark. But it wasn't. Incoming call. Lila Draper. Helen answered, quiet but clear. This is Helen. Lila's voice came through low, barely above a whisper. Hi. I didn't want to call, but could we talk for a moment, privately? Helen paused. Go ahead. I know you're within your rights, Lila said, but could we just get a grace period? Just 60 more days. Until after Christmas. Please. Her voice cracked. Helen said nothing for a moment. Then she stepped into the hallway, away from Ruth's curious glance. The hallway was dim, except for the soft glow of a sconce near the front door. Helen stood in the quiet, her fingers lightly grazing the trim of the doorway, as Lila's voice trickled through the phone like smoke from a candle barely burning. 60 days, Lila whispered. Just until after the holidays. We're not asking to stay forever. Just a little time to transition. Helen let the silence breathe. She pictured the Thanksgiving sublet, the second dog, the waiter's stunned face, her untouched water glass. And Lila that night, silent as wallpaper. You're asking me for grace, Helen said slowly. But I wasn't granted any. Not in public. Not in private. Not in private. Not in even as a mother. Lila's voice wavered. I didn't know he was going to do that. I swear, Helen. I didn't agree, but you didn't object. Another pause. This one longer. Heavier. Then Lila's tone shifted. No longer pleading, but colder, steadier. If you hold this line, you'll lose us. For good. Is that what you really want? Helen felt her spine lengthen. She stared out the window at the street lamp casting silver light across the empty sidewalk. That's not something you can lose, Lila. That's something you choose. You'll never see us again. That's your decision, Helen said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. It just closed the door. And then gently, she hung up. When she turned, Ruth was already clapping from the living room, slow and theatrical. Bravo, she said, lifting a wine glass. Delivered like a final scene monologue. I didn't want it to end like this, Helen said, moving past her toward the kitchen. She wasn't crying, but something inside her had turned over, like old earth being readied for planting. They had every chance to change course, Ruth said. They asked you for grace after draining you dry. Helen poured herself a cup of hot water, dropped a chamomile bag in, and watched the color swirl. The next morning, a thin layer of mist hung over the West End like gauze. Helen stood on her back porch in a quilted jacket, watering her roses one stem at a time. The soil was still soft from last night's drizzle. Petals shimmered with dew, untouched by frost, survivors of a waning season. Her phone buzzed inside the house. She didn't rush to check it. She finished every plant, pruning one wilted leaf with care before going back in. It was a message from Patrick. Eviction enforcement date is locked. Sheriff's Department confirmed. Final paperwork submitted. You're covered, start to finish. P.S. You did the right thing. Helen stared at the message for a long moment, then hit save on the notification and slid her phone back into her robe pocket. That afternoon, while she was folding linens in the parlor, the phone rang again. This time a number she recognized instantly. Gwen Miller. Helen picked up, pressing the phone gently to her ear. Gwen. Hi, Helen. Gwen said warmly. Just a quick moment, if you have it. Of course. I wanted to thank you again for dining with us the other night. It meant a lot to the staff. But more importantly, Gwen added, her voice now carrying a note of enthusiasm, we're hosting a charity gala in 2 weeks, fundraiser for the local food bank. Black tie, live music, press coverage, and I'd like you to be my guest. Helen blinked. You're inviting me. I'm honoring you, Gwen said plainly. For resilience, for dignity, and for reminding people that power doesn't always shout, sometimes it just signs the right form. Helen let out a slow breath, touched deeper than she expected. Then I'd be honored to attend. I'll have a custom invitation couriered to your door, Gwen said. Dress to be seen, Helen. This time they'll have no choice but to see you. As the call ended, Helen stepped to the tall window and looked out over the sloping street. Her roses swayed gently in the breeze. Beyond them, a quiet stillness blanketed the neighborhood like a pause in a symphony. But inside her, something was rising again. Something bold. Helen's heels clicked against the polished stone of the restaurant entrance, echoing like punctuation marks on a chapter she was ready to end. Her satin gown swept the floor in a shade of deep teal that shimmered like ocean glass beneath the glow of amber lanterns. A silver brooch, once her mother's, fastened at the collar. Everything about her tonight was deliberate. A curated answer to every moment she'd been spoken over, diminished or erased. She pushed open the grand double doors, and the crowd turned to see her. Gwen's charity gala, pulsed with quiet elegance, jazz humming from the quartet in the corner, champagne glasses clinking gently, trays of oysters and truffled canapes, drifting through the air like silver ships. Strands of warm lights draped across the tall windows that overlooked the harbor. But it wasn't the decor that made people pause. It was Helen. At her side, Ruth wore a black velvet blazer over a cranberry red silk blouse, her silver curls pinned back with something that sparkled. She leaned toward Helen with a grin. I'm sorry, but you look like the villain in a courtroom drama I'd root for. Good, Helen murmured, offering a tight smile. Let's give them something to remember. Gwen approached through the crowd like a hostess from a different era, calm, poised, impossible to ignore. Her gown was navy chiffon, her hair swept into a low bun. She embraced Helen briefly, then stepped to the center of the room with a wireless mic in hand. Thank you all for joining us tonight, she began, her voice carrying just enough to quiet the hum of the room. We gather not just to support the Portland Food Bank, but to honor women who remind us how strength really looks. All eyes turned toward Helen. Please raise your glasses, Gwen continued, for Helen Draper, a woman who knows her worth and makes sure others never forget it. The applause came in waves, warm, respectful, surprising in its sincerity. Even Ruth blinked at the intensity of it. Helen inclined her head, accepting it without flinching. She hadn't chased applause, but it found her anyway. Later she stood near the donation table and filled out her form in slow, confident strokes. $10,000. Anonymous. Ruth looked over her shoulder and arched an eyebrow. Helen simply said, let them guess. The cameras didn't leave her alone long. One snapped a candid of her laughing with Gwen near the dessert table. Another caught her with a glass of sparkling cider, toasting with Ruth under the twinkle lights. Flashbulbs caught the edges of her dress, the sharp tilt of her chin, the way she filled the space without apology. She was not fading into the background. Not tonight. And then, like a ghost from a different story, he appeared. Not Mark, but a man in a slate gray suit, holding a flat envelope and scanning the room with the certainty of someone with a job to do. Ruth spotted him first. That's either a banker or a process server, she whispered. Helen turned and smiled, just slightly. The man moved with purpose, stopping at Gwen first. They exchanged quiet words. Then Gwen pointed directly to Helen. He approached with professional calm. Helen Draper. Yes, she replied, already knowing. I've been instructed to deliver this during your scheduled public event, he said, passing the envelope to her. She took it with grace, barely glancing at the label. To Mark Draper, final court notice. Eviction enforcement. You're serving me, she asked, just loud enough for Ruth to hear. No, ma'am. he said, nodding respectfully. I'm serving your son. Helen tilted her head. Where? The man looked toward the entrance. He's in the parking lot. Refused to come inside. Said he wanted to see the circus without stepping in the tent. Helen exchanged a glance with Ruth. Ruth shook her head. He waited outside. He thought he'd catch you slipping. The man said. Instead he just got served. The flashbulbs fired again behind them, this time catching Helen mid-laugh. The court date landed like a gavel strike. November 14th at 10 a.m. Room 3B of the Cumberland County Courthouse. Helen read the notice 3 times, each word settling like the final stitches in a long seam. It was real. It was happening. No more smoke, no more delay. She forwarded the email to Patrick with the subject line, confirmed. Let's finish this. Across town, Mark was doing the opposite. You've got to be kidding me, he muttered into his phone, pacing his narrow kitchen. We can't do the 14th. I've got a client consult that morning. High profile, out of town, it's locked in. Patrick's voice on the other end was unbothered. Then reschedule the client. Mark barked a laugh. You don't understand how my business works. I understand how the court calendar works, Patrick said coolly. You were served. You were informed. You don't get to push the hearing like you push your luck. Mark cursed under his breath. You're siding with her like your family. I'm siding with the lease, Patrick replied, then hung up. Meanwhile, Helen stood in the front room of her West End property, sunlight pouring through the leaded windows as she met with 2 potential tenants, a retired couple from Bar Harbor. The woman loved the crown molding. The man asked about the fireplace. They were polite, curious, respectful. I'm hoping to have it ready before the holidays, Helen said, voice clear, firm. That depends on the current occupant's cooperation. We'd be happy to sign early, the husband offered, smiling. Helen nodded. I'll keep your file at the top. Back home, she placed their application neatly into a folder marked New Tenants. Ruth was on the porch, rocking gently with a mug of cider and a notepad. Well, they're decent, Helen said, handing her the folder. They don't know how lucky they are, Ruth replied, flipping through the pages. This place has history. History's what I'm finally cleaning out. By Friday, Mark had submitted a motion to delay the hearing, citing vague scheduling conflicts, an emotional environment, and an unnamed therapist's recommendation for de-escalation time. Patrick responded with a 2-line objection and attached the time-stamped text where Mark called Helen a controlling old ghost with a lawyer complex. Motion denied. The clock ticked forward. On Sunday night, Helen opened her inbox to find a subject line from Lila. Since you're committed to this, she clicked. The message was cold, clinical. If this is the route you insist on taking, you should know you're creating a fracture that won't mend. I've supported Mark through difficult family dynamics for years. What you're doing is cruel, strategic, and manipulative. You've made your priorities clear. Don't be surprised when we make ours. No greeting, no signature, just the echo of a slammed door written in pixels. Helen stared at it for a moment, then clicked archive. That's the closest you'll get to a thank you, Ruth said from the doorway. She'd read it over Helen's shoulder. She's trying to guilt you for her silence. She's already chosen her side, Helen said quietly. I'm just removing the stage. 2 days before the hearing, Patrick called. There's a complication, he said. Helen put down her pruning shears, still gloved from deadheading her lavender. What kind of complication? Mark's brought in more people, Patrick said. A couple 20s, maybe early 30s. They aren't on the lease, and from what I've gathered, they're living there full time. Helen froze. Are we sure? One of my contacts in the sheriff's office drove by on a routine check. 2 different vehicles in the driveway. Utilities spike. They're squatting with his blessing. Helen walked toward the edge of her garden bed, the breeze lifting the hem of her apron. That's another violation. Patrick confirmed. It'll help us in court, but it also means there may be resistance when the order comes down. You should be ready. Helen looked at her roses, still blooming, defiant against the October chill. Let them resist, she said. I'm not the one trespassing. They came and went at strange hours. A woman with fuchsia-dyed hair who smoked on the front porch. A man who wore headphones even while carrying groceries inside. Neither had Helen's permission. Neither was listed on the lease. But both were living in her West End property, bold as brass, as if the house had simply become available for the taking. Patrick caught them on camera from the sidewalk. He didn't say a word as he held up his phone for Helen to watch the footage. There was no sound, but she didn't need audio to hear what it meant. A stranger tossing a duffel bag into the back seat. A second car, a rusted white Honda, parking where Leela's SUV used to be. Someone flipping on the porch light at 3:12 a.m. They're full-time, Patrick confirmed, lowering the phone. Neighbors say they've been there for over 2 weeks. Helen, seated across from him at the long oak table in his office, folded her hands carefully in her lap. Did Mark list them on any documentation? Nothing, Patrick said. No sublet forms, no amendments, nothing in writing. They're ghosts as far as the lease is concerned. Helen allowed herself one long, steady breath. Then we're not just evicting a lease violator. We're clearing trespassers. I've added the violation to the court file, Patrick said, with time-stamped documentation and 2 notarized witness statements from the neighbors. Sheriff's office will review it before enforcement. Helen nodded. Then the house needs a new future. By the end of the week she had one. The Bar Harbor couple had followed up. Their background check came back clean, and the husband had written a handwritten thank you note, folded into their application. We see the love in this house. We'd be honored to carry it forward. Helen signed the new lease on her own dining room table, using the fountain pen she'd once reserved only for Christmas cards. Ruth sat across from her, sipping a root beer and watching the ink dry. Well, Ruth said, how's it feel to close a chapter? Helen glanced out the window where the hydrangeas had just started to brown, their petals curling like parchment. Like I stopped apologizing to the wrong people. Now that calls for celebration. They drove down to the harbor that evening and sat on a bench with paper trays balanced on their laps, lobster rolls steaming in butter, salt on their fingertips, and the sea air sharp enough to sting the inside of their noses. I should have done this sooner, Helen murmured, watching gulls glide over the gray water. You needed a catalyst, Ruth replied between bites. Turns out his name was Mark and his hobby was weaponizing dinners. They laughed, the sound carried away by the breeze. For the first time in weeks, Helen felt hunger without tension. Mark didn't return her calls. Not to discuss move-out details, not to deny the lease violations, not even to argue. He just vanished behind a wall of silence, one Helen had lived behind for too long herself. Now she left it standing where it belonged around him. Leela, however, chose another method. She took to Facebook. The post was long and vague, filled with phrases like family who turn on you when you need them most, and toxic legacies disguised as tradition. A few likes. 2 heart reacts. One distant cousin commented, thinking of you both. Helen read it once, closed the browser, and went back to her crossword. If she wants an audience, she should buy a stage. Ruth muttered when Helen told her. She already did, Helen replied. It's called social media. 3 days later, Helen's phone rang. The number was local but unlisted. She answered, Helen Draper. A crisp voice on the other end. This is Deputy Shaw with the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office. I'm calling to confirm enforcement is scheduled for Monday the 13th, 8 a.m. Helen didn't move. Your presence is not required, the deputy continued, but will secure the premises, confirm vacancy, and document everything. This will be handled professionally. She glanced at the small gold clock on her mantel. It ticked gently toward dusk. Thank you, deputy, she said, her voice steady. I'll be ready. The notice hit the door just after sunrise. Bright orange, stapled dead center. Order to vacate. Court enforced. It flapped lightly in the breeze, a warning and a promise all in one. The sheriff's car idled at the curb. Mark stood in the doorway barefoot, sweatpants slung low, hair sticking up in all directions like he'd barely slept. His mouth moved, but he said nothing. The deputy didn't wait for conversation. "You've got until noon," he said, slipping a second copy into Mark's hand. "We'll return to confirm vacancy. Anything left behind becomes the property owner's responsibility." Mark blinked. "That's today?" The deputy raised an eyebrow. "It's been today for weeks." By mid-morning, the driveway was cluttered with cardboard boxes, some sealed, some sagging with half-packed clothes and scattered papers. Mark stood in the garage, yelling into his phone, cursing about movers not showing up and people screwing him on short notice. Inside the house, Lila shuffled past the kitchen island, stacking dishes into tote bags without wrapping them. "She's a heartless witch," Lila muttered as she passed the front window, not realizing Helen's car was parked half a block down just out of view. Mark didn't respond. His face was tight with exhaustion, his gestures sharp and clumsy. The second golden retriever lay at his feet panting, surrounded by a nest of chewed power cords and dog-eared legal notices. No help was coming. No deadline extension. Just the sound of a clock winding down. Helen didn't watch the move-out. She waited until 4 p.m., 2 hours after the enforcement deadline, before pulling into the driveway. The sheriff had already come and gone. The house looked eerily empty. Blinds drawn, porch still dusted with boot prints and a lone key in a sandwich bag on the welcome mat. She bent, picked it up and held it for a moment. Not with sentiment, with precision. The locksmith arrived 15 minutes later. "New deadbolt on the front and the back," she instructed, holding the storm door open. "Keyed separately." "Will do, ma'am," he said, stepping inside with his toolbox. The inside of the house was quieter than she remembered it. No low hum of television, no scent of cheap cologne and takeout boxes. Just walls, hardwood floors, faint outlines where furniture had once been. She moved room by room, noting every scuff, every dent, every forgotten item. A cracked mirror in the hall, 2 opened moving boxes in the guest room, half packed, half forgotten, and in the bedroom closet, 1 dress shirt still on its hanger, her ex-husband's, not Mark's. She stared at it for a long second, then closed the door. By the next morning, Helen sat in her kitchen with a pen and checkbook, filling in the final line of the security deposit refund. She wrote the amount without resentment, every deduction accounted for, every line item supported. She sealed it into an envelope with the forwarding address Patrick had confirmed. Business, not bitterness. She placed the envelope in the mailbox, raised the red flag, and walked back up the path with no hesitation in her steps. At 2 p.m., the Bar Harbor couple arrived, smiling, dressed in cozy fall sweaters and holding a mason jar of fresh blueberry preserves as a thank you gift. "Welcome home," Helen said as she handed them the keys. They looked around the freshly cleaned foyer with wonder, the husband whispering something about the good bones of the place. The wife trailed her fingers over the built-in bookshelves, like she was greeting an old friend. Helen stood near the door, watching them settle in. It felt finished. Not like a loss, like a boundary, drawn clean, finally honored. Later that night, Helen was tidying up when her phone buzzed. Patrick Shea, 6:44 p.m., just closed the final paperwork file. New lease confirmed, sheriff's report processed, refund cleared. Nothing more pending. "You're free and clear." She stared at the words. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just free. She walked to the porch, the cool evening air curling around her shoulders, and looked out across the West End rooftops dusted in gold by the sinking sun. No shadows following her anymore. No unanswered questions. Just space, and silence, and the faint sound of her roses shifting in the wind. It started with the will. Helen sat in Patrick's office as a November drizzle traced lines down the window pane. The city outside moved with weekday indifference, buses sighing at stops, heels tapping crosswalks, but inside, the air was still and precise, like the space between 2 heartbeats. "I'm ready to update it," she said, her voice composed, final. Patrick didn't blink. He simply uncapped his pen. "And the son?" She looked him square in the eyes. "He's not part of the future I'm building." The pen moved swiftly over the form. Within the hour, Mark's name disappeared from every clause and beneficiary line, replaced by institutions Helen respected and people who had actually stood by her: the Portland Food Bank, the Library Foundation, and Ruth Connolly, who would inherit the West End home. She'd fill it with warmth and whiskey, Helen had told Patrick, which is more than I can say for the last occupant. The trust paperwork was notarized, filed, sealed. It felt less like revenge, more like release. The next day she visited the bank. The woman behind the counter, young, pleasant, a little flustered, double-checked the request twice before glancing up. "You want to remove your son from the joint money market account?" Helen nodded, and closed the shared access. "Of course," the woman said, typing quickly. "Just need a signature." With one flick of her pen, Helen erased his access to her emergency funds, travel savings, and the account she'd once opened for family support. It was long overdue. There would be no more tapping into her stability to fund his carelessness, no calls about unforeseen expenses, no more overdraft alerts from weekends in Bar Harbor, no more bailouts disguised as birthday gifts. It was hers again. Afterward, she pulled into the parking lot of her primary care provider, marched up to the front desk, and requested a change of emergency contact. "You're sure?" the receptionist asked, glancing at the old form. "This has your son listed." Helen tucked her gloves into her coat pocket. "I'm sure." She gave Ruth's information instead. Someone who actually picked up the phone. Someone who didn't question her judgment, or treat her as if she were made of spare parts. Forms signed. Systems updated. Records cleared. That night, as she poured a glass of chilled Riesling and settled onto her living room couch, Helen felt something remarkable: lightness. It wasn't the wine, it wasn't even relief. It was the quiet freedom that came from closing a loop, of no longer leaving the door cracked for someone who only walked through it to criticize the wallpaper. The clock ticked softly. Her roses, now clipped and drying in vases, perfumed the room faintly with the scent of the season's final bloom. She thought about how strange it was, how it had taken Mark's public slight to show her just how private her losses had become over the years, and how much space had been waiting to return once she cleared him out. The doorbell rang just after 8. Ruth stood there, cheeks flushed from the cold, a bakery box tucked under her arm. "You're officially done," she said, stepping inside. "Patrick texted me. Will signed, accounts cleared, contacts updated. You did the full sweep." "I did," Helen said. "It didn't even hurt." Ruth set the box down and wrapped her in a long, tight hug. "You did something most people never do. You reclaimed your life while you're still around to live it." Helen held on to her for a moment longer. "Now I want pie." "Perfect timing," Ruth said, opening the box. "But I think you're going to like this better." Inside was a delicate dessert, small, golden, topped with dark cherry glaze and a crisp sugar lattice. A card was tucked beside it. "Introducing the Draper tart, a dessert with bite, backbone, and just enough sweetness to be dangerous. Created by Chef Gwen Miller, Harborside Restaurant." Helen blinked. Ruth was already smirking. "Gwen says it's the most requested item on the seasonal menu since the gala. She named a dessert after me." "Oh, she immortalized you, honey." Helen laughed. Really laughed. The kind that cracked open the ribs. "He silenced my dinner order. And now you're on the menu." Ruth finished, raising her glass in salute. The maitre d' straightened his posture the moment Helen Draper walked through the front doors of Harborside Restaurant, a hush of velvet warmth brushing her shoulders. Her coat was ivory wool this time, her lipstick a confident cranberry. She didn't need a reservation anymore. The table was already waiting by the window, just as Gwen had promised. "Welcome back, Miss Draper," he said with a slight bow. "Chef Miller said to seat you with extra care." Ruth followed close behind, dressed in a slate gray capelet, with silver buttons, a scarf the color of black coffee wrapped around her neck. "You're practically royalty in this place now," she murmured, as they were led through the low hum of evening diners, jazz brushing the edges of the air. "I'm not here for a coronation," Helen said, eyes glinting. "Just a very particular dessert." They sat by the glass, the harbor just beyond, lights flickering across the dark water like tiny galaxies scattered on ink. Boats bobbed in the chilly tide, their outlines soft in the winter fog. The scent of saffron and roasted garlic drifted past them as a waiter arrived with 2 glasses of sparkling elderflower spritz. "Compliments of Chef Gwen," he said. "And she'd like to send the draper tart on the house, of course." Helen arched an eyebrow. "She's sure it lives up to the name?" The waiter grinned. "You'll see." Dinner passed in easy waves. Perfectly seared scallops, herb-rubbed lamb, conversation peppered with the satisfying silence of 2 women who no longer needed to fill every space with noise. Helen let herself linger. No need to hurry. No one to prove anything to. Every bite was chosen. Every word hers. When the plates were cleared and the lights dimmed just slightly for the evening service, the restaurant shifted. 2 waitstaff approached, flanking a white porcelain plate like it was a crown jewel. And there it was. The draper tart. Glossy cherry glaze. Buttery lattice glistening under powdered sugar. A faint crumble of toasted almond along the edges. Gwen emerged from the kitchen, apron folded neatly over her waist, sleeves rolled to her elbows. She approached the table with a smile that didn't demand attention. It earned it. "You finally came to taste it yourself," Gwen said. "I had to make sure you didn't overpromise," Helen replied, eyeing the tart with amused scrutiny. "Try it," Gwen said. "It's tart, it's rich, it's stubborn, and it finishes strong." The table beside them chuckled softly. A few staff at the back clapped, subtle but real. One of the line cooks peeked around the swinging kitchen door and gave Helen a small thumbs up before disappearing again. Ruth pulled out her phone. "Hold that fork just like that." "Yes, perfect. This one's going in the scrapbook under victory is best served warm." Helen laughed, really laughed, without that careful restraint she used to wrap herself in like armor. She took a bite. The pastry flaked beneath her fork like glass. The filling was bold and just shy of sweet. Layers of cherry spice and something deeper, cardamom maybe, unfolded across her tongue like a memory she didn't know she was waiting to recover. She didn't speak right away. She just let herself taste. And when she finally looked up, her eyes met Gwen's. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for the dessert, for remembering me when my own son wouldn't." Gwen's smile softened. "He made the mistake of thinking invisibility was the same as silence. You reminded us that some people only need one moment to reclaim a whole room." The night pressed gently against the windows. The harbor pulsed with motionless beauty, boats swaying under strings of holiday lights, sea breeze fogging the lower panes. Helen traced the rim of her dessert plate with the tip of her spoon, savoring the stillness of this second. Outside the wind shifted, and with it something else. A folded brochure had been left near the edge of their table, forgotten or perhaps placed discreetly. She opened it absent-mindedly. "The Ocean Trail Express, Maine to Quebec. By rail, experience winter from the window seat of your next story." Her eyes narrowed with curiosity. The image showed a snow-covered train curving along the edge of the coastline, steam rising like a ghost over pine forests. A woman not unlike herself, older, elegant, poised, stood at the train's window, coffee in hand, eyes locked on the snowy horizon. Ruth leaned in. "Tell me that isn't fate handing you a boarding pass." Helen smiled slowly. "I think it just might be." The cursor blinked on the screen like a quiet dare. "Confirm booking, Portland to Quebec City. Ocean Trail Express." Helen stared at it, her finger hovering over the mouse. The screen's glow softened the lines on her face, but couldn't hide the gleam in her eyes. Sharp, clear, unmistakably alive. Click. Just like that. The ticket was hers. First-class cabin. Window seat. 2 nights in Montreal with Ruth, then onward to snow-covered Quebec City. No return date locked in. The future, for the first time in years, wasn't a calendar, it was a canvas. They planned it over scones and jam in Helen's kitchen. Ruth had arrived with a stack of guidebooks and an old spiral notebook labeled "Trips We Meant to Take." "This one's been on page 3 since '98, Ruth said, flipping it open. "We always said we'd ride a train into winter." "Well," Helen replied, tearing a scone in half, "winter's just started. They booked hotel rooms with clawfoot tubs and river views, circled bakeries and bookstores in red ink. Ruth insisted on bringing a cashmere travel set. Helen bought herself a leather-bound journal. Not to write about the past, to write the rest of it. 2 mornings before departure, Helen wrapped herself in a navy wool coat and stepped into the crisp coastal air. The sky was a watercolor wash of pewter and blue. Seagulls circled lazily above the docks, their cries echoing over the low clang of harbor bells. She walked the long curve of the waterfront promenade, gloved hands tucked into her pockets, her breath puffed visible in the cold, each exhale a little lighter than the last. She passed the bench where she'd once sat, wondering if it was too late to reclaim her voice. Not anymore. As she neared Harborside Restaurant, a motion from inside caught her eye. Gwen stood at the window, drying a wine glass with a linen towel, the early sun catching the silver in her hair. When she spotted Helen, she smiled and raised the glass in a toast. Helen lifted her hand in return. A wave, not of goodbye, but of recognition, of quiet gratitude. She didn't go in. She didn't need to. Some conversations are more powerful without words. Back home, she laid out everything for the trip with the precision of a woman who once taught others how to pack for diplomacy. One carry-on, one handbag, a navy blue train coat with gold buttons, a silk scarf tucked in the corner of her suitcase, the same one she hadn't worn since her husband's funeral. But she folded it now, not out of mourning, out of memory. It had survived this far. So had she. The morning of their departure, Ruth arrived 10 minutes early, rolling a small plum-colored suitcase behind her and wearing sunglasses far too large for the weather. "Tell me I look mysterious," she said. "You look overdressed for espionage and underdressed for snow," Helen replied, smiling as she locked the door behind them. The cab pulled away from the West End with barely a sound. Helen didn't look back. At the station, the conductor tipped his hat and ushered them aboard. The train interior gleamed, cherrywood accents, brass details, velvet seats that cradled the spine just right. The hum of the engine began, slow and grounding. As the platform rolled away, Ruth leaned back and sighed. "To endings," she said. Helen sipped her tea. "To edits." The train followed the coastline, weaving past frosted trees and slate-colored water. Helen opened her journal and began to write. Not about Mark. Not anymore. He had become a footnote in a book that was already being revised. She wrote about wind and snow, about lemon tart and maple smoked ham, about how healing didn't always roar. Sometimes it just boarded quietly and found the next stop. Somewhere outside, a lighthouse flickered. Later that evening, as the train crossed into Canada and the sky turned navy, Helen stood by the observation window. The scent of roasted coffee wafted from the dining car. Ruth was behind her, talking to a young couple about Quebec's winter carnival. The view outside was a vast white wilderness, pine trees blanketed in snow, frozen rivers shining under moonlight. She took a long, steady breath and let the cold window kiss her palm. "This," she thought, "is the course I served. Not bitter, not vengeful, just deliberate, and cold, and complete." She turned to walk back to her seat, and smiled. The sweetest course is served cold, with paperwork on the side.